Welcome to Revolutionary References in Our Founding Documents. I'm Mr. St. Peter, your expert teacher and host, and today we are discussing the early acts of King George III that were created in the years 1764 and 1765. And most importantly, why and where do we find references to them in our most important founding documents? In order to begin this topic, we must first revisit the topic of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was fought between the British and the French over the official acquisition of the majority of land in North America, especially a region known as the Ohio River Valley. The war lasted from 1756 to 1763 and was eventually won by the British. However, not without a massive cost. During the war, the King of England died and King George III assumed the throne. In order to secure success against his enemies, he allowed massive spending to finance the war effort. This indeed led the victory over France, but the war nearly doubled the British national debt from £75 million in 1756 to £133 million in 1763. Those in Great Britain believed that British subjects in North America, as the major beneficiaries of Great Britain's war for global supremacy, should certainly shoulder their share of the financial burden. In order to recoup much of the money that was spent on this expensive victory, King George III and British Parliament would create several legislative acts that displeased the colonists. The first act that was legislated to the American colonists was the Sugar Act of 1764. The Sugar Act required a tax being placed on molasses, which along with tea was the most traded good worldwide. It also taxed other items that colonists would import from any other country other than England. Colonial merchants had often resorted to smuggling to avoid paying the tax, so the Sugar Act made it easier to bring smugglers to trial, which would be held in a vice admiralty court. These crown-sanctioned tribunals, which settled disputes that occurred at sea, operated without juries. Some colonists saw this as dangerous, and that a trial by jury is a basic right of Englishmen under the British Constitution. The second act that was legislated to the colonists was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 imposed a tax on almost every type of printed paper colonists used. Such popular items included wills, diplomas, marriage papers, newspapers, almanacs, playing cards, and dice. Every single one of these taxed items would require the purchaser to get a stamp that would show the proof of paying the tax. Other countries besides Britain had similar laws to this, but with this new legislation following the Sugar Act, the colonists saw this as a growing pattern of taxation on many goods. Their suspicions would continue and be proven correct in the future, as these two laws would not just be isolated events, but the first in a series of acts by King George and British Parliament. The grumblings of the famous colonial motto, "No taxation without representation," became more and more popular. This motto has been attributed to Boston patriot James Otis, the original founder of the Sons of Liberty, and whom John Adams called the father of the American Revolution. We find many references to both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act in our Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration, we find the list of grievances, which outlines over 24 individual complaints about King George III. The first reference to these is found here. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Later in the list, it goes on to mention, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. This is followed by a direct reference to the Sugar Act by grieving, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. After securing our independence in the year 1783, our founding fathers once again came together at the Constitutional Convention to construct our new system of government. This is known as the U.S. Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. In our Constitution, we set up the three branches of our government. And when it came to passing laws or collecting taxes, we were sure to give that power to the people rather than just one person. We find this in Article 1, outlining the legislative branch. It begins by stating that all legislative, or law-making powers, herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate, which contains 2 senators from each state, and a House of Representatives, where a state's representation is based on their population. Aside from the legislative branch's main power, the power to create and pass laws, later in Article 1, it lists that numerous powers of the legislative branch, including the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. This means all taxes must be voted on and passed by Congress, which is assembled to represent the people of the states. Speaking of states, we later read, "No state shall, without the consent of the Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports." Shortly after the ratification of the Constitution by the 13 colonies, we added the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which are known as our Bill of Rights. These protect the individual rights of the citizens of this country, and it is here that we find the 7th Amendment, which clearly states, "Trial by jury shall be preserved." Our founding fathers no doubt included these stipulations in our government to prevent the type of situation that angered the American colonists with the imposition of both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Not to be outdone, the British government created one more act that infuriated the colonists in 1765. This was known as the Quartering Act. This act addressed the providing of housing to British soldiers who were being sent to the American colonies for duty, which would steadily increase during the years of the Revolution. This act required colonial towns to build barracks to provide adequate housing for the king's soldiers. If the barracks reached full capacity, then public inns, stables, and alehouses were used. If these public buildings became full, then colonists had to provide housing themselves by allowing soldiers to stay in their own homes. Colonists would have no say in this matter and would have to give up their property and their privacy to provide quarters for British soldiers. This would obviously heighten the tension between the colonists and the crown, and would be a motivating factor in a great deal of colonial uprising against Britain, coming to a head with the Boston Massacre in 1770. The Quartering Act was sure to find its way into our Declaration of Independence, once again in the long list of grievances. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Additionally, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. It was easily determined by our founding fathers that the quartering of soldiers in the homes of citizens had no place in our new government. Thus, it certainly found its way into the first 10 amendments of our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which includes the 3rd Amendment, which clearly says, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." If a United States service person comes to your residence requesting housing, you absolutely have the option to allow them to stay at your home, but you absolutely have the right to decline. This freedom, and the other freedoms that we have covered today, were sure to be included in our country's most important founding documents in order to prevent much of the turmoil that was created by these early acts of the king. Thanks for watching as always. I hope you found the video informative and helpful. I'll see you again next time.